In this video, I'm going to walk you through the step-by-step installation process for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit on the 2018 Honda CB650F. I'll quickly review some of the key details of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the CB650F. The primary component is going to be a single piece of CNC laser cut and CNC formed aluminum powder coated in UV resistant satin black powder coat. Should match the undertail plastic kind of matte finish of the motorcycle extremely well. So it's going to look very OEM grade once it's installed. The Fender Eliminator is going to be designed for the factory Honda license plate light as well as the factory Honda turn signals. We will, however, also include a pair of round holes at the kind of forward section of the Fender Eliminator so that you can use aftermarket turn signals if you want to upgrade later on. Any kind of signal that uses the 10mm stud, which is kind of industry standard, is going to bolt right up to this Fender Eliminator. Some of the unique features of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator are going to be that we use pressed-in studs from Penn Engineering as well as threaded inserts so that you don't have a whole bunch of loose hardware during the install process and you have a fairly flush and clean underside appearance. Some of the things that are unique to the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator here that we are going to include rubber bumpers to minimize license plate vibration. We also include 2 rubber grommets for these oval holes to seal out road grime on the wiring looms coming into the tail section of the motorcycle. We also include 2 laser cut aluminum turn signal spacers that are going to help tighten up the rubber kind of bushings in the turn signal so that they don't kind of wobble around or sag on the Fender Eliminator. The last couple details of the Fender Eliminator kit in the hardware pack are going to be a zip tie mount and a zip tie so that you have a very clean and tight control of your wiring on the way to the tail section of the motorcycle, as well as 2 aluminum spacers to perfectly space the Fender Eliminator off the tail section of the motorcycle so that you're not like squeezing the tail section, and you have a nice rigid connection, and 2 K-locks or flange lock nuts for these 2 studs. This kit is proudly made here in the United States, Southern California, and it should be the most OEM grade kit available for the Honda CB650F and CBR650F in terms of utilization of the factory lights to keep you fully DOT compliant, as well as come from a fit and finish standpoint. There's a lot of features in this top plate that make it match exactly with the tail section of the motorcycle. As for tools you'll need for this installation, you need a 5mm Allen key, preferably an L key like this or a T-handle or a combination of the two. A Phillips screwdriver. You'll need an 8mm socket and an 8mm box wrench. Also need a 10mm socket. Some of the other tools that are kind of optional but very useful to have are a pair of flush cutters like this for zip tie cutting, and a flathead screwdriver to help with kind of prying the factory fender apart. For this video I will be using a power driver to speed things up, but that's not necessary. Now, like most Fender Eliminator installations for the CB650F, we're going to start by removing the rider seat. That's going to be key in the left side of the frame, and popping the latch and pulling up and back. Now once you're under the seat, before we actually pull the fender, we're going to disconnect all the wires. I'm going to start with this zip tie that's holding the entire bundle together. That's going to include wires for the fender as well as for the tail light. So we're not going to pull and disconnect all these, but you can take this essentially connector boot that's got all the connections you'll need. You can kind of start to free up these wires. We're actually not going to need the 3-pin white connector at the end for your tail light, your brake light, but you are going to want all these 3 orange, white, and blue 2-pin connectors. Now you can either use your fingernail, kind of lift up on them once you kind of pull this boot back, or if you can't really get a good purchase on them, you can use a very small flathead screwdriver to help lift up on those. So you're going to disconnect these three connectors. You'll see these are going to be going to kind of under this little crossbar on the subframe. These are going to be your right and left turn signals and your license plate light. And so we're going to, now that these are disconnected, we can actually pull the fender and start to disassemble it. Now there are 3 bolts that hold on the factory fender, and they're actually at 2 different planes, so it is possible to kind of bind yourself up here. There's going to be 2 bolts back here, they're all 5mm Allen keys, and then there's a third one that's kind of hidden under this triangular cross brace. You could technically take all these fasteners out, but if you do have just a standard L key, you can get it into that fastener without taking that brace off. And so once you get it at least started to get loose, you can use the ball end to finish the removal of it. Now set these aside, try not to let them rattle down into your subframe. For these 2 rearward ones, you can get a straight T-handle on it, which makes it much easier. Now when you are removing the fender, as you start to spin these bolts out, grasp the fender with your other hand so it doesn't just either bind up the screws or just fall off your motorcycle. Once your bolts are loose, you can always take these guys out separately. You will notice that your wiring is all kind of coming through this crossbar. In particular, the blue one is coming across to a hole on the brake side of the motorcycle. So gently start feeding the connectors out of their respective. You can kind of see the blue ones. You don't want to pull on this if at all possible. You can kind of start with this guy on the brake side, the blue connector, and slowly feed them out. On the left side, they're going to be a little tighter because there's 2 connectors going through the same kind of small triangular hole that we'll take out a look at in a second. But once you get them out, you can set the factory fender on a bench and we can break it down. Just a quick note on the 3 button head cap screws that you're going to pull from the factory fender. We're actually going to reuse one of them because they're nice hardware and it'll fit perfectly. The other 2 you're going to set aside just for storage. You're not going to need them. So one of the things that I think is really useful in these videos to look at is kind of once you remove the factory or fender, what you're left with on the motorcycle. Just because a lot of fender eliminators out there are real simple, just folded sheet metal, and you're going to end up with difficulty with a bunch of the areas on the CB650F, including these 3 holes are at different planes. So this third one in the front is actually at a different angle than the other 2. So that's the reason why our fender eliminator is just 2 studs and 1 threaded insert, so it can essentially install cleanly right up in there without essentially fighting angles. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is there's actually not a whole lot of flat surface, and there's 2 areas for the cables to go through. So in combination with these kind of triangular bumps on this undertail, it's not exactly a simple kind of panel to close out. And so if you look at the Vagabond fender eliminator, it's got 2 grommeted slots that are going to feed into the 2 wire channels, and then it has this kind of 2, well, it's actually a 3 bend flange that kind of closes all this out. And you'll actually notice the license plate, the turn signal flanges on the right and left actually hang out outside of these flanges, such that when it does install, it closes out the body line of the tail section on the motorcycle extremely well. And so that's something that I think a lot of our competitors on the market aren't doing. The last thing to kind of notice is we actually clearance out on this top bend for this little bump in here to really allow us to seat on the tail section of the motorcycle as tightly as possible. Now to start breaking the factory fender down, we're going to actually, it's 2 plastic halves, we're going to split it apart. There's 8 Phillips head screws that are holding this all together. You can use a power driver or a manual screwdriver. These 2 guys towards the back are some of the more challenging ones to access with a power driver without a long extension, so we'll just go ahead and use the manual one here. These are all going to be these plastic thread cutting screws. So so they're not exactly gonna get easier. They should just kind of stay sticky the whole way out. And as a note for all these, we're not going to reuse any of these screws, but I usually keep them and use it, just put the factory fender back to the way it was so that you can store it more easily. And once you've got the 8 Phillips screws out, you actually kind of have to just like disconnect the two halves. They're kind of like snapped all together. The easiest thing to do is you can see the license plate light, those two kind of bosses right in there. You can kind of grab the whole fender and like pop them out like that. So you can start there, and then you see there's like a living hinge in the plastic, which you want to try to not to like rip open essentially, but you can use a flathead screwdriver and kind of pop your way, at least through the first couple. And then what you want to do is kind of unzip that top half from the bottom half. So we're going to work on this kind of upper half that has all the lights in it. I like to start by pulling the license plate light out of it, and in this application the license plate light has a big spacer on it, and it's just easier to pull the light and the spacer off all together. Then you kind of feed out. License plate light is going to be the white connector all the way out. Save the hardware so you can put it all back together. And then deep down inside of this spacer you'll see two 8mm nuts, and that's going to be how we get the license plate light off the spacer. So you can go ahead and grab your 8mm socket and kind of hold. These are going to be locking nuts, so you're going to have to kind of hold on tight. But pull. We are going to, anything on the license plate light side, those two nuts, the light itself, and then more importantly we're going to push out these two little steel bushings, and then we'll unpeel this grommet. We're going to keep this grommet. It'll keep the weather sealing and the vibration to like factory levels. And then we can set that spacer aside. So once we've got the light out, license plate light out, we just have to move to the turn signals. And on this Honda, Honda turn signals all look similar from the outside, at least on a lot of bikes, but these are held in ever so slightly differently. And so there's two large Phillips screws on the back side of the lights that hold the whole assembly together. And so start by removing that. You can kind of unthread the light and the connector, and then you're left with this large kind of steel center and the boot. And both of those you take out. We're going to reuse those. So you just repeat the process really quickly on the other light. This is going to be the right light with the blue turn signal, blue connector. Start by, you can always, if you find like you're fighting the connector, you should always be able to unthread those steel components. And then just pull out the grommet. At this point, we're done with the factory fender, and we'll move on to the Fender Eliminator. So to start the assembly process of the Fender Eliminator is going to come with the two rubber bumpers for the license plate flange install, but it is going to come with two rubber grommets separate and a zip tie mount. And the zip tie mount you just install in this kind of central hole. All you do is push it in from the top surface, and we're going to use a zip tie through here to secure wiring. The two grommets you can actually install before we get the wiring done. This will make things just a little easier to manage. you can actually thread the wires through these grommets after they're installed. And just kind of look at them on both sides of the flange and make sure they're sitting flat. Other grommets that we need to install are going to be the factory grommet for the license plate light, and that's just going to have the right and left holes actually have like an actual lip to them that you kind of push through the hole in the Fender Eliminator. It's going to look, it can definitely look a little kind of twisted and not flat. And then the main thing is you look on the rear surface, you kind of push with one hand and kind of flip the lip of the grommet with the other. The light, when you install it, is going to straighten a lot of this out. But what you can do is then install those two, and you definitely want to try to avoid doing that, which is just pushing that grommet right back out. Let's try that again. So get the license plate grommets installed, and then supporting it from the front surface, you can kind of install these two steel kind of bushings. The last two grommets that we might as well install while we're here are the two kind of chunky turn signal mounts, and they are going to have kind of a rounded end and a pointy end. The pointy end is going to point towards the front of the motorcycle, and there's really no magic to these except obviously they have a groove in them, and that's going to go in this flange of the Fender Eliminator. So I start usually at one end, doesn't really matter which, could be the front, could be the back, push it all the way to that end, and then kind of work your way around, and you kind of do have to shove them in, and then they'll kind of pop through, and you can see that the rest of the turn signal grommet is inside now. So we'll do that on both sides. It's kind of useful to get all the kind of manhandling out of the way before you actually start working with the lights, just in case you would scratch them up in this process. So once you've gotten to a point that you have license plate, light grommet, turn signal grommets, and the extra Vagabond supplied wiring grommets, we're ready to actually install all the lights. We're going to start with installing the turn signals into the Fender Eliminator. And what you may be able to tell is that these grommets are a little loose in the flanges of the Fender Eliminator, just because the thickness of the factory Fender is ever so slightly thicker than the Fender Eliminator flange. Now, Vagabond is supplying the kit with these two extra kind of oval washers. So these are custom laser cut by us, and all they're really going to do is help squeeze the turn signals, a little tighter, so that they're nice and rock solid in the Fender Eliminator. So it's just a nice little touch, but they are an extra step in this process. But otherwise, they're exactly like removing them. So we're going to start with the right lens, in this case, blue connector. Thread the electrical connector through, and then instead of going straight through this kind of steel core, we're going to go through one of the Vagabond washers. So you can just let it kind of slide down, and then the connector through that kind of mounting bracket. Then we're going to sandwich that Vagabond washer in between the bushing and that cover plate. Now, all that really means, and they should be fairly well registered, but you do want to kind of make sure they sit kind of seamlessly with that surface of the grommet. Now, one thing you'll notice is that if you look down here, that bolt hole is not going to be like exactly centered, but if you give it a little squeeze, it will become centered. And so you can do that. You can kind of grasp it with one hand, install one of the, grab the other one, these very short shouldered Phillips head screws, and kind of give it a little squeeze while you tighten it up, and it's going to allow the shoulder on that bolt to register correctly. And once you've done that, you can see this is much stiffer than if you'd done it without this washer plate. And so we'll move on to the left signal, the orange connector, and repeat the process. Slide the connector through, kind of get some of it in first, the Vagabond washer plate, then the steel mount plate, and just easier to remember that this kind of tab with the threaded fastener or the threaded insert on it faces towards the front of the motorcycle. But you're going to squeeze that washer plate, and sometimes you can have to scooch it around a little bit to sit correctly, just so it doesn't, so it looks right. And then you can slowly pull your turn signal onto it. And again, I find it easy to, with one hand, kind of preload the whole assembly, and that's just giving you your preload on your bushing when you install that fastener. And as long as you're getting the shoulder of that black screw in and you're not kind of trying to shear the plastic body of the turn signal, make sure these are nice and tight, because that's what's holding on your turn signals here. You should end up with a very nice stiff factory-like mount, as opposed to something that's going to kind of, I mean, droopy is the wrong word, but it'll see a little bit of gapping at the top surface. So once you've got your turn signals, excuse me, we'll move on to the license plate light. And you're going to start with your license plate light, thread it through the large central hole, and the two studs on that are going to go on top of or through the two holes in the grommet with the two bushings installed. Now things are starting to get a little tight back here, but not so much so that it starts to help if you kind of start pulling your wiring away. Grab your 8mm socket. I'm going to push that out this way. So once you've got those 8mm nuts mostly bottomed out, you may have a little bit of challenge getting them to go all the way down, just because your socket may start fitting kind of awkwardly. You may just grab your, it's probably going to be easier just to grab an 8mm wrench and finish them off. And these ones you can, because you're making essentially metal to metal contact with these steel bushings, you can just go full tightness. What I mean by that is, like, you don't have to, you should actually feel a lot of times these are very, although sometimes a little bigger than 8mm, so they may be a little hard on your wrench. But bottom those guys out, you'll feel them get tight. Make sure you are cleanly seated all the way around your light. At that point, we just have to move on to wire management. Just like the factory bike, we're going to actually pull the looms up in two different paths through each of these two grommets. The blue connector on the right turn signal is going to go by itself. And this one is pretty easy to thread through the grommet by itself and then pull the entire loom through it. You kind of have to support the grommet. The loom is actually what gets kind of sticky on these, but you should be able to, and I'll show you how the alternative. Sometimes when you're pulling on it like that, you may pop those grommets out, and that's fine. It's just that the loom is actually relatively sticky on the internal diameter of and I'll show you how you can kind of, on the one with two you kind of have to anyways, but if the grommet pops out, just feed it down and then actually install it in that oval hole with the loom inside of it. Shouldn't be that difficult, especially on the one with only one connector. It'll be a little more difficult on the side with 2 looms. And we'll do that now. So the white and the orange connector are going to go together on the other hole. And these can sometimes be a little bit of work, but with the grommet free, you should be able to slide it down pretty quickly. Sometimes they kind of want to roll over on themselves, which is okay. Just pick one side of the connector first, and then feed the other one through. At this point, you're going to have to stretch the grommet out a little bit, which is totally okay. Pull both. Seems like the slippery exterior on the the license plate light connector is much easier to feed through. But then once you get them kind of close, you'll give yourself a little slack. Just you kind of just jam the grommet into that hole, starting at one end of it and working your way around. And you should be able to eventually pull your way through. Alright, so once you've got all your 2 wires through, it should be really tight on the 2 connector, but you just got to take your time and work yourself around that slot. This one will be a little looser, but what Vagabond's giving you is that one zip tie mount in the middle. You're going to kind of make like a little X out of the loom, but this is going to be your opportunity. So you just take your zip tie, you should be able to kind of eyeball where that slot in that zip tie mount is, feed it through into a loop, and you don't have to make everything ultra tight, but what I do like to do is give yourself, when I say tight, like you don't want to pull on this section, but what you do want to do is give yourself a little bit, and you can always, if you're feeling like it's getting too tight, pull yourself back through the grommet a little bit. It shouldn't be that challenging. And then give yourself a little bit of service loop. And service loop's the wrong word. A little bit of slack in your wire loom so that you can sync your zip tie. You're not pulling on your license plate light or your turn signals. Pull your zip tie down, tighten it up, trim it, set of flush cutters, and then this part can get a little snugger now, so you can, on the top side of your X, you can pull through a bit. If you want, you can always push that zip tie over to the side, but then you end up with something where you should have, call it some service play in your looms, but this is going to keep it out of the way. It's never going to kind of vibrate out, and you're ready to, at this point, move on to the motorcycle install. And the only thing to note here is that the Vagabond kit is going to come with 2 aluminum spacers. And this is going to allow you to sandwich the subframe really securely, instead of just like squeezing a bunch of plastic. You're going to be able to go direct to like a bottom out, and so it's going to be very secure. And so just slide those 2 spacers over the 2 studs on the Fender Eliminator, and at that point we're going to carry it over to the motorcycle. Now, to install the Fender Eliminator onto the motorcycle, just make sure you've got those 2 supplied aluminum spacers on the 2 rear studs. Start by feeding the electrical connectors. Remember, the blue one is going to go on the connector, or the kind of triangular hole on the right, and then just feed them forward for now. We'll deal with the exact loom situation on the top side in a second, and then the other 2, the orange and white, are going to go on the, and if you start to get a little bit tangled up, just start by pulling the electrical connectors forward up through that crossbar, and then we'll tidy them up. So slowly kind of pull those 3 looms tight, and then start guiding in those 2 studs into the 2 rear holes. Now what that's going to do is kind of get you all lined up. Take one of the supplied 10mm nuts and just with your hand spin it down. And since these are flange locking nuts, you can go all the way down without hitting the locking section. And all it's going to do is let you take your hands off and finish up. That's the convenient thing about having the studs, is you don't have to fumble with loose kind of long bolts during this process. Everything's kind of self-guiding. With that, we'll go to the top side and finish the install. So on the top surface, you're going to spin down the 2 locking nuts supplied with the kit onto those 2 studs and tighten them up. These you'll actually feel bottom out when you're tightening it up with your socket, and you can put a nice torque on those. The last bolt, the 3rd one, you're going to reuse one of the factory button head screws in that central hole, and it should line up really well. You should always try start these kind of bolts by hand, but if you can't, then use an L key to try to get the best angle possible on it. And then once you're in and you just want to tighten it up, you can use a big T-handle like this. And this one isn't bottoming out on a spacer, so just snug it up. This one is just going to help close out that front surface of the panel. It's not actually super structural like the rear bolts. So once you got the bolts on, it really is just wire management at this point. And one of the things that I mentioned is the blue turn signal connector, the 2-pin for your right signal. Easiest to come out straight out of here. We're actually going to feed it back around this little triangular brace so that it comes out with all the others. What I mean by that is we're going to reuse eventually that cable tie. First of all, I would start connecting your 2-pin connectors for your turn signals and your license plate light that we had already disconnected. Okay, so once you've got all your 2-pin connectors connected, there is this little slot in the rubber boot that holds them all in, and that slot goes on this little tooth on the undertail tray. So you just have to slide it over that tooth. All the connectors should go kind of facing down, and then behind this little boss, the plastic bosses. Obviously once you've done that, you're left with and this, make sure you tuck this guy back underneath there so it doesn't get caught, which it has a habit of doing. So this connector is well controlled just like the factory. What you are left with is an extra loom of the 3 for the turns, the 3 looms for the license plate light and the 2 turn signals. And so what you're really going to want to do is take a little bit of time to coil up your 3 kind of long extra bundles, and your license plate light, the kind of glossy one, is going to be your longest one. But take the reusable zip tie that's on the factory bike, and you're going to want to try to grab the entire, all 5, so including your brake light and this kind of grounding strap, so that you have a nice bundle of wires, and this service loop. And so take your time. This is your opportunity to get this as tidy as possible. But what you want is you want a service loop of this wiring that kind of ties it up into a nice little bundle at the tail section of your bike. And then once you've completed that, snug up that reusable cable tie. Make sure you're not pulling really hard on, for example, like your tail light or that ground strap. But we'll do a quick systems check after we complete it. Other than that, all you have to do is put your seat back on. So slide it under that front catch. Make sure your rear catches are on their way, and push it down until it clicks. And then you're done. Now, one of the things that we always recommend you do before you ride the motorcycle after you install the Fender Eliminator is do a quick systems check. Make sure not only does the license plate have illumination, that your turn signals are functional, but 100% make sure your brake light is operating correctly, just in case any of the wiring that you were tugging on essentially isn't connected correctly. So do a quick systems check before you ride the motorcycle. Now, without the installation of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the Honda CB650F is complete, I'm going to give you a couple extra walk around views of the installed part. Again, this is compatible with the fared version of this motorcycle, the CBR650F. And when we sweep underneath the Fender Eliminator, give you a feel for how kind of cleanly the wires are managed as they go into the tail section of the motorcycle, as well as how clean it is with respect to exposed fasteners and things like that. With that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. If you guys want to check out our parts or buy them directly from our website, please go to www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Our parts are also available for sale on eBay and Amazon for your Prime members. Thank you very much.